My name is Hannah Peterson. I am an AmeriCorps member at the Washington Conservation District through the Climate Impact Corps program. I have been working a lot this past year on a project regarding HOAs and stormwater management and maintenance practices, which led to a conference on May 31st, 2024. And this is a recording of that conference, which I'm very excited to share with you all.
Thanks for coming. My name is Andrew Coyne. I am the City of Stillwater Natural Resources Technician. I've been with the city about 2 years now, and I do everything from trees, natural resource projects, not just weed management, and then I'm also in charge of managing our MPCA stormwater permit. So today I'm just going to talk a little bit about, just go into what a storm pond is, the difference between stormwater ponds and natural wetlands, a few different types of basic stormwater ponds, a little bit about ownership and easements, and then just some brief material on pond inspections and pond maintenance. So a stormwater pond, according to the Minnesota Stormwater Manual, is any constructed basin that is built for the purpose of capturing and storing stormwater runoff, either temporarily or for an extended period of time in order to prevent or mitigate downstream water quality or quantity impacts. That's a lot, but yeah. Therefore, capturing pollutants, sediment, nutrients, and they also help to prevent flooding from heavy rain events on our impervious surfaces. So all of our stormwater ponds, they may have somewhat different designs, but they all have similar functions, which are to reduce runoff, prevent pollutants, sediment, and nutrients from discharging into freshwater bodies, and then to treat that water to remove some of the nutrients, the pollutants. Pretty common way that this happens in these ponds is just gravity. So all those nutrients, heavy metals, anything like that, it comes into the pond and falls to the bottom. Then it stays there. That's the goal, is to keep all of that stuff at the bottom of the pond so that the water that is leaving the pond is clean and ready to go into freshwater bodies. There may be some ponds out there that look like stormwater ponds that are actually natural wetlands. And key differences in those are just that natural wetland is just a natural feature. It relies on plants and animals to maintain the ecosystem balance. They're not intended to treat water or to store stormwater. And after rain events, they're usually going to stay pretty level. They may come up a little bit, but they're not designed to capture and store large amounts of water like a storm pond is. So a stormwater pond is a man-made engineered structure for storing and treating stormwater runoff from impervious surfaces like roads, sidewalks, anything that doesn't have drainage. It allows for the storage of sediment and pollutants and nutrients. The big nutrient that we are trying to eliminate from entering our water bodies is phosphorus, but there are other macronutrients that also make their way into that water, and we just don't want that making its way into the end destination of every stormwater pond, which is either a lake, a stream, or a river. Some ponds have mechanisms designed to remove additional nutrients and pollutants through their chemical or physical processes. One that we have in Stillwater, we did in collaboration with Browns Creek, is we installed an iron enhanced sand filter up on one of the tributaries on Browns Creek. And that iron helps to pull more of those nutrients out of the water before it reaches the fresh water. Most of these ponds are going to have one outlet, possibly two outlets. So that's where the water leaves when the pond fills up and it's above the storage capacity. There's usually going to be more than one inlet. Sometimes there's just one, but that's, so water comes in the inlet, nutrients, sediment fall to the bottom. When that water level rises, it then goes out that outlet and continues on down the line. We usually, in Stillwater, we have trash and debris guards on all of our inlets and outlets to just catch some of the mostly leaf litter, sticks, trash, things like that from building up in the ponds. And one thing that you'll often see with a stormwater pond is you'll see just a bright green mat on top of that pond, and it's usually midsummer, probably starting about now. And what that is it's a process called eutrophication. So high nitrogen levels in water cause algae to fix that nitrogen, and basically the algae spreads, covers that whole pond. And so when you see that green stuff, it's usually from a fertilizer containing nitrogen, and it's not usually a bad thing. It's usually just how it works in those ponds. We're putting nutrients in there, so it's just inevitable that you're going to get algae blooms. With these stormwater ponds, the water level is going to shift possibly several feet depending on the intensity of a rainstorm. And then it's going to go back down, in contrast to a wetland or a pond, natural pond, where it's just going to kind of level itself out. So I'll say three categories of storm ponds that we use. We have detention ponds or dry ponds. We have retention ponds, which are wet ponds, and then infiltration or filtration basins, which are normally attached to a wet pond. So dry ponds are constructed for capturing runoff. The water level is going to rise up after the rain event, but then eventually that water is going to drain through the bottom of that pond. It's just going to stay dry until the next rain event. So when you see just kind of a dry basin, usually it's just grass, maybe there'll be other plants in there. That's an intentional feature to capture that water, but still keep that land usable for other things. So this often happens in parks, places where we have like a sloped area, somewhere where we can just naturally catch water, but still want to use that land. A retention pond is a wet pond, so it stays wet, it stays filled with water. It's going to stay basically at the level of wherever the outlet is. It's relies on settling and biological processes to remove pollutants and nutrients. So some of the biological processes are just native plants that will capture some of those nutrients and use them to prevent that from exiting the pond. And infiltration basins they could be solitary. A lot of the time they're connected to a pond or another water feature. And so those are designed to drain water fast. So they're designed with some sort of porous material below so that it will drain the water. The goal is within 48 hours, and then it prevents that water from even entering that pond. In a high intensity rain event, that's not going to happen. You're still going to get water stored in the pond, but infiltration basins eliminate a lot of that. So ownership and easements, we get a lot of questions about this, and it's going to vary from city to city. So I don't know how many of you are HOAs in the city of Stillwater. If you are not, some of this may be slightly different, but you can contact your engineering department of your city to get their policies on these things. So drainage easement is an easement for the purpose of controlling, preserving, and providing for the flow or storage of water. It allows the city or government entity access to maintain that pond or other feature, and then it prevents the owner from doing certain things to that land that would either restrict access or diminish the function of that. So it's something that you own, either the city, the county, whoever has an interest in that land, so they have a legal right to use it, and it's still yours. So sometimes there's some confusion around that. So to know if you're in Washington County, to find out, just a quick way to find out if your pond has a drainage easement on it, you can use this awesome free resource called the Washington County Property Viewer. So it's just a county funded online GIS program where you can go find any parcel in the county. You can find all sorts of different information about that. One of them is, I don't have a cursor on there. One of them is easements. So I can explain this more if anybody wants to contact me, but basically you go in, you find your parcel, you go up to the little layers tab, and then you can just go down and turn on easement annotation, and you can find all of the easements that exist that the county has recorded. If you can't find that information, I suggest contacting your city or your local watershed district, because they should be able to provide you with that information too. So in the city of Stillwater, maintenance always falls, so we maintain all of our ponds that we own, unless there's a maintenance agreement in place, which I don't think we have many of those. But if it is privately owned, like this one here, so you can see there's still a drainage and utility easement on that pond. The owner is not the city. So the city does not have, we don't maintain that pond. It's the responsibility of the owner or HOA, unless there are maintenance agreements in place. So stormwater pond inspections. We are required, every MS4, every community that has a stormwater permit is required to inspect every single pond and outfall once every 5 years. That's the conditions of our permit. We, in the city of Stillwater, we also inspect all of the other pipes because we want to make sure that everything is functioning. So for inlets and outlets, which are the pipes, there's a lot of different forms of them, but they'll do the same thing. We inspect those for sediment buildup, for large deltas forming in front of those inlets, trash and debris, erosion, and then aggressive vegetation. So you want that inlet to be clean. You don't want large vegetation growing into it, especially trees, things like that. You want to make sure that water is able to flow out the way it needs to go. And if there's a bunch of sediment in front of it, then that's just going to keep catching more and more sediment, and it builds up this big delta. And then we have to go in and we have to dredge it out. You also want to look for illicit discharges. So anything that is not stormwater, so any leaves, debris, fertilizers, detergents, basically anything that's not just water is considered an illicit discharge and is prohibited from entering stormwater ponds. To look for these illicit discharges, you're probably going to see trash, you're probably going to see leaves, debris, and that's just inevitable. But if you see things like suds, oily sheens, discolored water, foul odors, murky water, things like that, that's a sign that there may be something depositing into that water that should not be in there. In that case, I would contact us, or if you're in another city, contact their city, because we have to report and document every illicit discharge. After you inspect your inlets and outlets, you want to check the bottom of your pond. You just want to make sure that the depth is adequate. So on a 5 to 10 year basis is kind of when you should be inspecting that depth. You can just do like a visual inspection. You can look for deltas, things like that. That's kind of what we're doing just for the basic inspection. Once that pond is maybe closer to full, you can get what's called a bathymetric survey done by an engineering firm, environmental firm, or possibly your city to determine the actual depth of that pond. So you use that depth to determine how much storage space is left in there. Once it's at a certain level, it's time to dredge that pond out. And then on the banks, you want to be looking for erosion and exotic vegetation are the main two. But you can see on this bottom pond here, that bank is heavily eroded there. And that's something that we definitely want to be preventing, because that's just causing more sediment buildup, causing more potential nutrient sediment runoff. So after you've inspected, you may have some things that you need to maintain. Inlets and outlets are they're pretty much constantly in need of maintenance. We're only required to do it every 5 years, but after 1 year, even if you clean that outlet out, you're probably going to find a bunch of trash, debris, things like that. So you want to make sure you're cleaning up sediment buildup, any sort of organic or inorganic debris. And then you want to make sure that there's no scour. So scour would be like basically like erosion around the outlet or inlet structure where the soil is basically just starting to expose the that structure, and that is something that we definitely don't want because those structures are very expensive to maintain and to replace. So scour is going to cause water to get under that pipe and cause some big problems in the future. With the pond banks, it's a good idea to install plants or even seed, do things like mulching, hydro or straw mulching over that seed, things that aren't going to wash out into the water, but you want to make sure that you're getting vegetation on that bank, because an eroded bank is just going to keep washing out more and more every time it rains, and it causes a lot of excess sediment buildup in the pond, which then causes you to have to dredge it faster. So with the pond depth, the general rule of thumb is a pond is going to take about 20 to 25 years until it's full. So it's not very frequent. And I know that Andy is going to be going more into detail about long-term budgeting for those things. But yeah, generally in Stillwater, it's every 20 to 25 years where we have to go dredge a pond. It can be pretty expensive, but it can be budgeted for because it's more of a long-term thing. And then vegetation is another constant one. So there's always going to be some sort of invasive species. You're going to see a lot of things like reed canary grass, buckthorn, other invasive shrubs. They thrive in those kind of disturbed open areas. So making sure that you're on top of the invasives and keeping natives in place is a great idea to just maintain the pond long term and to prevent things from degrading from invasive noxious weeds. So when I inspect a pond, I go out, I find any sort of invasive vegetation, I assign that to our public works and make sure that they're getting that. We make sure that we're removing any trees or other woody vegetation that's growing near structures, because over time those roots are going to work their way into those cracks in there, damage those inlets, outlets, things like that. And like I said before, those are very expensive to replace. So you want to make sure you're on top of woody vegetation, invasive vegetation, and then even just thinning out, if you have nice plantings on there, just keeping it thinned out so that they don't get overrun by other weedy things. So that's the basics of stormwater maintenance. It's not too terrible. It's mostly just plants, sediment, trash, and once in a while dredging. So with that, that is my presentation. It sounds like we're doing questions at the end, but my contact info is here. So if you are in the city of Stillwater and have any questions, just give me a call or shoot me an email.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Cameron Blake. I work for the Washington Conservation District, which is the soil water conservation district of Washington County. I get to talk to you about native plants and soil health, which is, well, the second one is my favorite thing. So I'm excited. So native plants, when we're talking about native plants, we're not talking about kind of the traditional landscaping cultivars or Kentucky bluegrass that you usually see across landscapes. When we're talking about native plant communities, it's the species of plants that typically grew in kind of the area, both the environmental conditions and the species that kind of get along with each other across the landscape. So you can see, this is a diagram of the Twin Cities. You can see the Mississippi River curve, the St. Croix. There we are on the outside. So we're Washington County right there on the outside. So you can see we've got a lot of the openings and barrens. Basically the plant species that would grow there on their own without us doing anything about it. What's so great about native plants? So this is a diagram of the root systems of some prairie plants that you find in Minnesota. So for the very, very left, that tiny little stripe there is an example of what Kentucky bluegrass looks like for scale. So you can see the difference just in the root system. The other good things about native plants are because they are suited and part of the ecosystem that they grow in and are found in. They are a great food source for pollinators. They're great for wildlife, and they just generally fit within this whole ecosystem service. They do multiple different ecosystem services. So not only are they providing a food source on the top for pollinators, but their roots are building the soil. They're feeding the microbial community in the soil, and just overall, they provide a lot more benefit than something like Kentucky bluegrass, which you can see would not have a very good ability to hold soil or hold water for that much, and doesn't provide any food source for any pollinators. In the context of stormwater systems and native plants, typically this is what the system we're kind of talking about. You can scale it up and down however you need to, but typically we've already talked about stormwater ponds, but water is directed into the system, and where it infiltrates both into the ground, it also is taken up by native plants and evapotranspirated, and in doing so, nutrients, pollutants, all that kind of stuff is being broken down as well. So that's kind of how we see native plants in these systems. And I just want to put some examples of some native plantings. So you can see they are very beautiful if you take care of them, if you've got a good variety in there. You've got flowering species just like you would conventional greenhouse plantings. The other thing about native plants is they tend to be perennials. So it's not like you have to, when you have your yard species and you have annuals and you have to plant them every year, right? Well, these ones come back every year. So that's also a nice thing about native plants. There's different heights. You can, depending on what kind of look you're going for, if you want a taller planting, a shorter planting, usually the goal of the design is also to have species that flower at different times of the year. So there's a good visual impact all throughout the year, as well as a food source for pollinators all throughout the year. Just want to show some examples of some other native species, milkweeds. Also, native plants, same as with your traditional landscaping, they're suited for all kinds of light and growing conditions. So there's still flowering species even in the shade. If you ever take a walk in the woods in Minnesota in the spring, you'll see those beautiful wildflowers that we have. And kind of all throughout, whatever your conditions are for your stormwater features or your native plantings, you can find ones that'll grow in any of the sun. And like I was saying, mixture of grasses and flowering species are what's best for both just for the look of the planting and for the ecosystem services that they're providing. So yeah, incorporating native plants, it's not hard to do. It's can approach it, kind of in the same way that you would do your traditional landscaping, and it's just kind of something that we're excited to promote. I want to talk a little bit about installation and maintenance of these, and if your HOA in your neighborhood is already established, you might have established plantings already, so this isn't as relevant. But if you were looking to install some plantings, typically with native plantings, the first year maintenance tends to be kind of the hardest, the first year or two. Native plants over time don't need nearly as much input, whether that's watering or any kind of fertilizer or anything like that. But the first year, it is really important to maintain it well so that you're setting yourself up well for your future years. So the first year, plants, depending on the kind of conditions of that summer, we've had some droughty years. So for the first year, you do need to provide some water for your plantings typically. And then weeding becomes very important depending on usually the newer plantings, you're installing plants that are smaller, and then they'll grow and take up their space. But in that first year, you're going to want to do the weedings to make sure that they're not getting choked out or outcompeted. And then after that first year, we like to say native plantings, rain gardens, they're low maintenance, they're not no maintenance. So if you aren't paying attention, you can start having issues. So annual maintenance, it's good to get your eyes out on what you've got on your property. Remulch if new mulch is needed, if that's the type of planting you have. Not all of these stormwater systems or plantings have mulch, but if there is mulch, you might need to add mulch. If you have smaller plantings and they're kind of in obvious places, you can do your spring clean out, we like to call it. We like to leave the senesced vegetation that native plants have over the winter. It actually, that's where our next year pollinators are, their habitat. They're actually in that that's nest vegetation. So we usually recommend waiting until the weather's warmed up consistently, and then you can go ahead and remove that material if that's the style of planting you have. Otherwise, prescribed burdens are a great way to kind of take care of that as well. As you're looking at your plantings, it's good to notice if there are if plants have died off and if there's starting to be gaps, if you want to replace those so that you're not allowing any space for weeds and invasive species to come in. Andrew touched on that. I'll talk about that a little bit too. And then Andrew already talked a bit about or a lot about sediment removal and inlet clean out if this is a stormwater feature that has entrance and exit. These are things that you should look for just to make sure that there aren't. Invasive species are, unfortunately, we deal with them in our gardens too, right? Weeds and invasive species. They are not native. They typically were brought in without us knowing that they were going to start to become a problem. There's different ways to control invasive species. Mechanical could be mowing, hand pulling, depending on the scale of your practice. Biological is referring to there's some species specifically that there's some biological control options out there. Typically, something you would ask a professional about. And then there's herbicide use, chemical use to maintain these plantings as well, or you cannot. It depends on how you want to approach it. All these different control methods, they're just like our weeds in our gardens. It all depends on their life cycle, whether they're an annual species, biennial species, or perennial. And then big takeaway of this is if you don't have people that are super excited about going out and weeding and doing stuff, there are lots of companies that maintain natural vegetation. So it's just something to look at and contract out for your HOA. My favorite topic, soil health. So not just looking at the plants on the top of the soil, but thinking about what they're growing in. Definition of soil health is basically you want the soil to function as the system that it's providing for plants, animals, and humans in the context of stormwater management and kind of what we're in native plantings and what we're talking about. The main pieces that we're looking for the soil to be able to do is to continue to infiltrate water, continue to sustain plant life, and then to support under the soil a microbial community that is also assisting with removing pollutants and cycling nutrients. Now, soil health in this context for stormwater features, often the soil that you find in the actual practice itself is not, it's actually it's an engineered media. So it's something that when these practices were installed, they were likely excavated and then this engineered media was put in. It's very specifically designed to infiltrate. That's kind of its number one job, while containing just enough organic material to keep the plant community alive if it's a system that has good native plants. So it's going to look different than like the soil that you would find in maybe the surrounding buffer around the pond or in your yard. You'll see it's a lot sandier, and it's designed to be that way. So that's why it will look that way. If you walk down to the bottom and start poking around, at least with infiltration basins and rain gardens. So just wanted to note that, so you're not confused on why the soil looks the way that it does. Why is it sandy? Like everything else is not sandy. So aspects of soil health to also keep in mind. There's could kind of go into this all day, but I'm trying to keep it more superficial. So soil health, you can look at the soil structure. The diagram below is kind of a nice example of when you've got a healthy soil, the soil kind of can hold its shape. There's places for the water to infiltrate into the ground. If you dig it up, it tends to have, there's like a darker color in there, and that's what's supporting the plant community. Versus degraded soil, you can see that it really doesn't lend to water infiltration at all. That's when you start having the plants will start dying off too, because they're not being supported by the soil that's there. In organic matter and the stormwater systems, it's a little bit of a different lens or approach than if you're looking at it in not a stormwater system. Again, the infiltration basins and whatnot, you don't want too much organic matter. If you're starting to see a buildup of organic matter, that's probably something that needs to be taken out, but you do want to see enough that the plants are being supported. And then again, compaction is kind of a big deal with these infiltration basins. So sometimes after construction, if there's been too much heavy machinery moving around, if the soil gets really, really compacted, it's not going to allow for the system won't function the way it's supposed to. So just something to note if you are noticing the soil seems to be really, really hard, that could be causing problems with how the system is functioning. There's different ways to go about addressing compaction, kind of on like smaller scales and larger scales. But the best you can do is make sure you're incorporating organic material into your soil. If we're talking about like a lawn, you can do aeration and incorporation of like amendments like compost and things like that. And that'll help with your compaction issues. You'll see a lot better performance with water going into the soil the way it's supposed to. And then last aspect of soil health that is of concern is talking about the microbial activity that's in the soil and the rhizosphere. I'll talk a little bit about that on this next page. So yeah, so plants are growing on top of the soil, but there's also a whole system going on with plant roots and microbes in the soil that basically microbes are feeding the plants are feeding the microbes, and they're creating this really healthy system that is aiding in that nutrient uptake that we are concerned about in Minnesota with phosphorus. They're like pulling that phosphorus out of the system. They're breaking down heavy metals. They're doing all of the treatment of the stormwater that we're hoping to see that keeps the environment, in a better condition. So the microbial community is really important as well. And if you got healthy soil, healthy microbes, healthy plants, the whole system is working the way that it should. Why you should care about soil health? Like I said, when the native plants are in place, the soil's in good condition, it tends to be able to hold water for longer, especially given the droughts we've had in the last few years, less irrigation being needed. That's kind of a big deal here, especially as we're concerned with water costs and groundwater pumping and all that kind of stuff. Less fertilizer is needed, so they tend to be feeding themselves rather than having to put in. You shouldn't really, if you've got a healthy native planting, you really shouldn't need to add any fertilizer. That's different than traditional landscaping, where you typically have to budget for that and have someone who knows how to apply it and all that stuff. It kind of can take care of itself in that way. Also, the erosion issues that Andrew was showing some pictures of, when you start seeing structural and erosion issues happening around stormwater ponds or rain gardens, if the soil is in good shape and your plant community is in good shape, it's going to hold all that structure together. And then you don't need to repair it, which is good because that can get tricky. And then again, if you have better soil health, you have happier plants and vegetation. You don't need to do as many inputs. It's all just cost savings and less of the maintenance.
And there we go. All right, it's working. Excellent. So again, I'm Andy. I'm very glad to be here with you. I'm from the University of Minnesota. What we're going to talk about, I really appreciated Andrew and Cameron's presentations because they set this up well. We're talking about stormwater treatment practices. If you dig into this, if you go on the web and look, you're actually going to find these appearing under many names. You might see best management practices, BMPs, but you might also see stormwater control measures, green infrastructure, green stormwater infrastructure, and actually a whole host of other acronyms and names they go by. But they're all talking about the same thing. And what you really need to be thinking about is that there's many different types. So we've seen examples of ponds, stormwater ponds, and we've seen examples of rain gardens and other vegetated systems, but there's many others that you might encounter in your neighborhoods and in your HOAs. But the questions we're really worried about, what I think the first two presentations and what I'm going to reiterate, is we need to know, are they working? And if they're working now when they've been constructed, that's primarily because of design and construction went well. But if you want them to work in the long term, it has to be maintained. Just like our homes, just like our cars, just like our bikes, if we don't maintain them, they aren't going to last. Stormwater treatment practices are exactly the same. And I like to use the term stormwater treatment practices simply because I feel like it's more specific. Best management practices is used in business. It's used in many other aspects of society, and it's not really very descriptive. So you'll hear me say stormwater treatment practices. So why do we use these stormwater treatment practices? And Andrew actually kind of spoiled it for you already by giving away the answer. But there's three primary purposes that they serve. The first is to reduce the runoff rates. That's what we say in the stormwater profession, reduce the runoff rates, which really is just how fast it flows. If we have high velocities and we have water moving downstream quickly, it can cause flooding. That's what we're trying to minimize. We want to actually slow that water down and hold it back. But we're also trying to reduce the runoff volume. That's how much water there is. And the reason we're doing these two things, because if you think about our urban landscapes, think about all the rooftops, roadways, sidewalks, parking lots that we put in our urban landscapes. Those are impermeable surfaces or impervious surfaces. The water can't infiltrate into the soil. Before we had all of those, much more of the rainfall soaked into the ground. In our urban landscapes, we see much more runoff of the surface. So much of our rules, much of our designs for these stormwater treatment practices is trying to restore that natural hydrology. So we're trying to reduce the runoff rates, runoff volumes, but also the pollutants. We want to reduce the pollutants. In other words, all the nasty stuff that we find in stormwater. Again, all the stuff, typically human source, that's on our urban landscapes that gets washed off. But these are the three primary goals, and we do it by a variety of different ways. We use stormwater ponds, as we've seen. We use vegetated systems like rain gardens and swales and buffers, but we can also use things like sand filters. Sand filters, these are basins with a sand media in there that will reduce primarily sediment, sand, and particles. But we can also have dry basins that help with removal of pollutants and reducing runoff. Stormwater ponds we talked about. We can also use amended or enhanced filters and practices. These are things where research like what we're doing at the University of Minnesota is looking at ways to improve the performance of these stormwater treatment practices to get at more pollutants or to be more effective at infiltrating the water into the ground. So there's a variety of ways we can do this. And again, these are, just some examples of the different types of practices you might see. But what can you do? We have cities and we have watershed districts and we have state agencies that are doing a lot in this stormwater realm. So what can you as residents and homeowners associations do practically in the landscape to kind of help move this forward and also in the end of the day save yourselves money? The first step is inspection. And again, some of the previous presentations touched on this a little bit. I won't go much into detail other than just saying these are intended to be very quick, very simple, visual assessments of these practices. And really the purpose is to schedule maintenance. You want to know, is it working or not? And what can you do to get it working if it's not? Okay? Many of you probably walk around your neighborhoods or bike around your neighborhoods or bike around, and you probably see many of these stormwater treatment practices. Oftentimes, walking by something is enough to do a visual assessment. And I'll touch on that at the very end. I'll give you some examples. But really, we're trying to schedule maintenance. We're trying to identify things that are wrong so that we can do maintenance, which are activities that ensure the proper function. In other words, does it work? Let's make sure it works. And we want to make it last longer. These things are expensive. Think about how much we spend on houses and cars and other things like that. We do maintenance to make sure we get the value out of it. Why would we not do the same thing with our stormwater treatment practices? Okay? You do not want to invest in rebuilding these prematurely. You want to get as much usable life out of them as possible. But there are many resources available to you for this. So just one example, we do have inspection checklists. You can go deep down this rabbit hole if you'd like. There are many, many resources out there. This is just one. These are checklists that are made for a variety of different stormwater treatment practices. That really, at most, I think there's 15 or 16 questions on the longest one. They're intended to be done in 15, maybe 20 minutes at the most. But something that will really give you a sense of, is it working? And if it's not working, how can you fix it? Or who can you call to help you fix it? Okay? And they are intended to be a resource, something you can use, you can adapt. You can edit, copy, or amend as needed. And this link that's here, that's available, I think that's in the fact sheet as well. So you have that, and all of these resources will be made available to you. But what it's really trying to do with these inspection checklists is getting at how to maintain them, how to keep them working, how to identify when they're not working, and then how to correct that. And really, that inspection piece is critical, because if you don't look at it, if you don't inspect it on a regular basis, you're not going to be able to identify those problems. Out of sight, out of mind is very much true. So look at these things. And oftentimes you can look and you will notice something different just at a casual glance. And that's an indication that, you know what, let's look a little closer and see what's going on. So doing these assessments is critical. And really what you're focusing on is, how does it work? If I go back to what I said earlier and what the previous presentation said, we're trying to get stormwater into these practices, oftentimes infiltrating that water, evapotranspiring that water, or holding that water back for a period of time, and removing pollutants. So the things you're really looking for is to make sure the water is getting in and out the way it's supposed to, and that there's nothing unusual. And really what you can do is look for critical failure. We talked about erosion already, which is a great mention. Anytime you see stormwater washing away sand or sediment or soil in a place where it's not supposed to be, that's a problem. And that can grow into be a very big problem very quickly. We actually suggest in some of the guidance, again, if you dive into this in deep, you'll find that when we identify erosion in any of our visual inspections, we try to categorize that. Is this something you need to take care of before it rains next? Because some erosion problems, the next storm, you don't know what the next rainfall is going to be. It could be a half-inch little drizzle, or it could be a 10-year storm. It could be 4 inches very quickly. And a small erosion problem with a big storm becomes a big erosion problem. So looking for things like that. Clogging is another thing that you can very quickly assess visually. If you have debris or litter or anything else building up on either how the water gets in or out of these stormwater structures, that can cause major problems. That can actually cause water to bypass and create erosion problems. That can cause flooding. That can cause street flooding, or even structure like homes and basements to get flooded if water can't get in and out of these practices the way it's intended to. And that's something that you can look for very easily. And honestly, like I said, if you're just biking around or walking around, if you see something, what I like to say, large and unusual in your stormwater treatment practice, that's a cause for concern. It's very easy for you to identify that and then talk to someone. If you're not sure what to do, just talk to somebody. Call the city, call the watershed district, and find out. Just say, hey, I saw this. I don't know if it's a problem, or I think it's a problem. You know, can you help me out with this? And we would love to help. So let me give you a little bit of idea. If you want to be more active in participating in this, what would that look like for you? And I'm just going to summarize some of the findings in a survey that we did a number of years ago now on stormwater treatment practices and their inspection and maintenance activities. Now, we asked a number of questions. Many of these you don't need to worry about, but we were looking at, what kind of stormwater treatment practices are out there? What's that diversity of practices that are in our urban landscapes? But then we focused on the maintenance. How often is maintenance performed? How complex is that maintenance? Is it something citizens can do? Or do you have to have a licensed excavator to do this type of work, or a licensed professional engineer to write up drawings and contract documents to get this work done? Why is that maintenance needed? What are the major things that cause poor performance in our stormwater treatment practices? And at the end of the day, most of us are interested in how much does it cost? How much should I expect these things to cost to do maintenance? So the takeaways from this survey, and again, all of this is online. I can share more details if you want to dive into those details. But really, most of these maintenance activities for our stormwater treatment practices in our urban landscapes, most of the maintenance is done less than once per year. You often don't have to do maintenance every year. It can be helpful. Things will look more aesthetic and more well kept if you're doing it every year. But honestly, you don't have to do it every year on most things. And honestly, most of the maintenance we do is very, very simple. You don't need a professional. citizens, summer interns can be trained to do the majority of the maintenance on these stormwater treatment practices. Okay? So you don't have to be afraid, you don't have to be intimidated. And you don't necessarily have to hire contractors to do it. You certainly can, but if you have active participants, active residents that are excited about this type of stuff, they can do it, and they can get a lot of it done. And that can actually save a lot of money. A lot of the costs, which we're going to talk about shortly, come into labor and mobilization. Getting crews out to these sites actually accounts for a lot of the cost, because most of the maintenance is very simple. And most of what we do is removing sediment, litter and debris, build up like that, and managing the vegetation if it's a vegetated system. There are other maintenance activities. This is not the end-all be-all, but the vast majority of the maintenance we do is to manage sediment, litter and debris, and manage vegetation if it's a vegetated system. And it can be very simply done. But the maintenance costs can be significant. We found when we were doing this research and research since then, for the most part, maintenance activities are undervalued and under budgeted. We found most cities, watershed districts, and other entities that build things can get money and can get grants to build infrastructure. They can get capital funding, but they struggle to get maintenance funding, and their budgets reflect that. And thus, we see that they can't maintain things as often as they would like to or they think they should. So maintenance costs are significant. And if you're going in, if you want to know what it is and what you should budget, I'm going to give you numbers that you should expect to budget. It might not match what the places around you are budgeting because they simply can't. But if you want to be proactive about it, this is what you should think about. Now, I have this fancy graph. I'm not going to talk about this. I'm not going to explain it. But I only show it to show you that there is data behind this. We have lots of data. We've done lots of regressions and analysis on this. We have good confidence in the data we're going to present. But what I broke it down to is a very simple rule of thumb. And the way this rule of thumb works, and this is my only equation. I'm an academic. I'm from the university. I have to show you an equation for me to get a paycheck. So my equation here is if you add the costs of what you would spend to construct that practice, how much it costs to build it, and then you calculate how much it's going to cost to inspect and maintain it over time. There's a period of time at which your maintenance and inspection costs are going to exceed your capital costs. Okay? And that changes based on how much it costs. If you spend $1,500 to build something, if you have one of these small rain gardens in your front yard or in your neighbor's front yard, many cities, watershed districts have cost share programs where they'll give you $1,000 or $1,500 to help you build a rain garden. That's a typical cost for some of these small practices. In about 5 years, you will spend about $1,500 doing inspection and maintenance on that practice, if you are contracting it out. If you do it yourself, you will probably spend quite a bit less. Okay? You might spend almost nothing because, again, it's the labor, it's getting the crews out there and having the knowledge to do it. There's a lot of value in that. If you break that down, that's about $300 a year or maybe even 20% of the construction cost per year on these small practices. That's because there is an economy of scale. If you go up to a practice that's about $15,000 to build, you're going to spend about $15,000 in inspection and maintenance over 10 years. After 10 years, your total inspection and maintenance cost is actually going to be more than your original capital cost. Okay? So these are some of the things you should be thinking about. If you build a bigger stormwater pond, let's call it $150,000. And again, the numbers are a little weird with the fives because it's adjusted from $2005 to $2023. But if you spend about $150,000 to build something, you're going to spend about $150,000 in inspection and maintenance over that 25-year life cycle. And that's because you might not do much other than vegetation management, a little litter and debris cleanup over the first 20 years or so. But then, as the first presentation said, as Andrew said, you might spend $100,000 dredging that sediment out. So you're going to have a big ticket item. You don't want to be surprised by that year 20 maintenance. You want to be saving over that 25-year life cycle so that you have that nest egg ready for it. Okay? That's what I'm trying to give you these numbers for, is to give you a sense of what can you plan for, how can you save small amounts every year so that you have that available. And honestly, if you put this together, if you save these numbers, and these can be very big numbers, I understand that. I totally respect that. I'd rather have you have that money in the bank to be able to do the work that needs to be done than get surprised by something and then not be able to do it. That's kind of what I'm trying to give you here. But again, you can save a fair amount of this if you're doing your own inspections, if you're doing your own minor maintenance. Because, and I didn't show this, but I often show a slide where I talk about the different levels of maintenance. Honestly, if you do inspection and you do routine maintenance where you're managing the vegetation, you're cleaning out where areas where you might get potential clogs, if you're preventing erosion or rectifying erosion when it starts small, you can often avoid major maintenance costs. And so overall, in the long run, I think you could have, potentially this could cost way less if you're being very diligent about it on a regular basis. So as I said, there's way more information out there and available to you. If you want to know more, we have an online manual that's called Assessment and Maintenance. It talks quite a bit more about how to do inspections, how to do maintenance, how they're related, and a lot more details. All the details I kind of shared today are embodied in this. There's an online version. Again, this link is in the fact sheet that likely you all have, but we also wrote that into a handbook mostly for city staff, engineers, designers, consultants, and things like that. But you can learn a lot from it if you want to. If you want to dive in deep, there's a lot of details out there. But you can also get more training. We actually have at the University of Minnesota a program called the Erosion and Stormwater Management Certification Program. It's simply called erosion.umn.edu, and they have a number of courses that you could take if you wanted to know more. The slides I shared today actually are pulled from a 2-day certification course that we do on permanent stormwater treatment practices, focusing on inspection and maintenance. I gave you the gist, I gave you kind of the Cliff Notes highlights from that course, but you can get a 3-year certification through a 2-day course. And then for those that want to continue that certification, there's a recertification every 3 years that you can take to re-up that certification. But they also have a single course on just the development of stormwater treatment maintenance plans. And again, some of the things I talked about today, you would go in deep. How do you take your sites that you have, whether you have rain gardens, stormwater ponds, constructed wetlands, or anything else that's in your responsibility, you would develop and learn how to develop maintenance plans for those specific sites. So there are courses for that available, again, if you want to get into those details.
Support for this project is provided by the Stormwater Research and Technology Transfer Program with funding from the Clean Water Fund from the State of Minnesota's Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment. Additional support comes from the Minnesota Stormwater Research Council and its member cities, watersheds, private businesses, the University of Minnesota Water Resources Center, Minnesota Sea Grant, the College of Food, Agriculture, and Natural Resource Sciences, and the National Institutes for Water Resources, funded by the U.S. Geological Survey. Additional support and funding for this project comes from the Washington Conservation District. Thanks for watching.